My name is Eleanor Chambers.
You can verify that in 30 seconds.
A federal judge.
Right, and I'm the Pope. You people always got a story.
You people?
Empty your pockets now, or I'm taking you in for
You
obstruction.
have no grounds.
I said empty your pockets.
The wine aisle was quiet that Wednesday evening, soft jazz playing through the speakers of Harrington's Fine Foods, an upscale grocery store in the wealthy suburb of Millbrook Heights. The shelves were lined with bottles that cost more than some people's weekly groceries, and the clientele that evening was sparse, mostly professionals stopping in after work, browsing organic produce and artisanal cheeses. Judge Eleanor Chambers was among them, pushing a cart slowly through the aisle, reading labels with the careful attention she brought to everything in her life. At 58 years old, she had spent 22 years on the federal bench, presiding over cases that shaped civil rights law, sentencing corrupt politicians who thought themselves untouchable, and earning a reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the Eastern District. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was just a woman in a beige cardigan and comfortable slacks, tired from a long day of court proceedings, wanting nothing more than to pick up a nice bottle of wine and some ingredients for dinner. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose as she examined a Bordeaux, completely unaware that her quiet evening was about to become a nightmare, captured in high definition by 6 security cameras positioned throughout the store. What happened in the next 23 minutes would be broadcast across every major news network in the country, viewed over 47 million times online, and would ultimately dismantle an entire police department's culture of protection. Sergeant Dale Vickers, 44, pushed through the automatic doors of Harrington's Fine Foods at 7:43 p.m., responding to what dispatch had described as a suspicious person call from an anonymous source. He had 18 years on the force, a record his supervisors called solid community policing, and a sealed personnel file that told a very different story: 31 complaints over 15 years, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and systematic intimidation of minorities in public spaces. Every single complaint had been reviewed by Internal Affairs and dismissed as misunderstandings or unfounded accusations. Vickers had learned over nearly 2 decades that he could operate however he wanted as long as he claimed to be responding to legitimate concerns. His partner that evening was Officer Neil Grady, 29, 5 years on the job and known throughout the department for one defining characteristic: he never questioned anything Vickers did. He followed orders, backed his senior officers' reports, and had learned that silence was the fastest path to promotion in a department that valued loyalty over accountability. Vickers' eyes scanned the store methodically as he entered, moving past the white customers browsing near the entrance, past the elderly white couple examining produce, past the white businessman on his phone in the deli section. His gaze stopped when it reached the wine aisle and the only black customer in the entire store. Something about her, he would later claim, didn't fit the neighborhood profile. He couldn't articulate what that meant, couldn't point to any specific behavior that warranted suspicion, but his hand was already moving toward his duty belt as he walked directly toward Judge Eleanor Chambers, who was still reading the label on that bottle of Bordeaux, completely unaware that the next few minutes would change both of their lives forever. Vickers stopped 3 feet behind Judge Chambers, close enough that she could sense his presence before she turned around. His voice cut through the quiet jazz music with a tone that wasn't a question but an accusation. He wanted to know what she was doing there, why she was in this store, in this neighborhood, at this hour. Chambers set the bottle of Bordeaux back on the shelf carefully and turned to face him, her expression calm but confused. She explained simply that she was shopping, that she lived 12 minutes away, that she stopped here regularly on her way home from work. It was the kind of explanation no one should ever have to give for existing in a grocery store, but she offered it with the composure that came from 22 years of managing hostile courtrooms. Vickers wasn't satisfied. He demanded identification, his hand drifting toward the taser on his belt in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. Chambers asked a simple, lawful question. Why did she need to show ID when she hadn't committed any crime? The question was reasonable, constitutional, the kind of thing any citizen had the right to ask. But Vickers interpreted it as defiance, as a challenge to his authority that couldn't be tolerated. Grady shifted his weight uncomfortably behind his partner, recognizing something was wrong but saying nothing, doing nothing, failing in the most fundamental duty an officer has to the public. Chambers, drawing on decades of remaining unflappable under pressure, slowly moved her hand toward her purse to retrieve her wallet. The movement was deliberate, careful, non-threatening. But before her fingers even touched the leather, Vickers screamed at her to freeze, his voice echoing through the store as he claimed she was reaching for a weapon. Chambers stopped instantly, both hands rising to shoulder height, palms open and visible, explaining calmly that she was simply trying to comply with his request for identification. The contradiction was captured perfectly by 3 different security cameras, an officer demanding ID, then treating the attempt to provide it as a lethal threat. What happened next would be replayed in courtrooms, on news networks, and in police training seminars for years to come as an example of everything wrong with American policing. Vickers grabbed Judge Chambers by the shoulder and spun her roughly toward the wine shelf, ordering her to place her hands flat against the wood. The force of the movement knocked several bottles from the shelf, sending them crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and red wine that spread across the tile like blood. The sound made other shoppers turn, made a stock clerk drop what he was carrying, made Grady take an involuntary step backward. But Vickers wasn't finished. He kicked Chambers' feet apart with his boot, forcing her into a position of maximum vulnerability and humiliation, then began conducting a pat-down search that went far beyond any standard procedure, his hands rough and invasive, deliberately degrading, the kind of search designed not to find weapons but to establish dominance and inflict shame. As his hands moved across her body, he muttered words that the security cameras would capture with devastating clarity. He said that, "You people always have an excuse," that she had picked the wrong neighborhood to cause trouble, that he could always tell when someone didn't belong. Chambers remained silent throughout the assault, her legal mind working even as her body endured the violation, cataloging every word, every action, every civil rights violation that was occurring. When Vickers finished his search and found nothing because there was nothing to find, Chambers spoke in a clear, steady voice loud enough to be captured by every microphone in range. She stated that she did not consent to this search, that she was complying under duress and threat of violence, and that she was a federal judge for the United States District Court. Vickers actually laughed, the sound cruel and dismissive. "Sure you are, sweetheart, and I'm the President of the United States." The commotion had begun drawing attention from throughout the store. The crash of wine bottles, the raised voice of Sergeant Vickers, the unmistakable tension that filled the air it pulled shoppers from other aisles like gravity, their ordinary Wednesday evenings suddenly intersecting with something they would never forget. Dorothy Ashworth, 71, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 4 decades shaping young minds in the public school system, stopped her cart at the end of the wine aisle and watched the scene unfold with growing horror. Her hand moved to her chest as she saw a woman her own age pressed against a shelf, being searched like a criminal while wine pooled at her feet. A young couple, Ethan and Mira Osei, both in their late 22s and still wearing their hospital scrubs from shifts at Millbrook General, recognized immediately what they were witnessing. Without a word to each other, both reached for their phones and began recording, capturing angles the ceiling cameras couldn't reach. Franklin Doyle, 54, a retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant who had served 3 tours overseas and now worked as a logistics consultant, stepped closer than the others, his military bearing evident in his posture. His voice carried clearly through the aisle as he announced that he was witnessing what appeared to be an unlawful assault on a compliant civilian, and that he was prepared to provide a sworn statement. Vickers' head snapped toward the growing crowd, his face reddening with anger at having his authority challenged. He pointed at them and warned that anyone who didn't mind their own business would be arrested for obstruction of justice, that he would personally ensure they spent the night in jail. Dorothy Ashworth didn't move an inch. Her voice was steady, carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had faced down defiant teenagers for 40 years. She said she knew wrong when she saw it, and what she was seeing was very, very wrong. Grady's eyes darted between his partner and the witnesses, the phones, the situation spiraling beyond anything he could justify in a report. Judge Chambers had maintained her composure through the illegal stop, through the humiliating search, through the degrading comments about you people. She had remained calm because that was what she had learned to do in courtrooms, full of hostile defendants and aggressive attorneys. Stay steady, document everything, let the truth speak for itself. But now, with Vickers' search complete and nothing found, she asked the only reasonable question left. Her voice was measured and clear as she asked if she was free to leave, given that she had committed no crime and his search had produced no evidence of wrongdoing. It was a lawful question, a constitutional question, the kind of question that should have ended this encounter with an embarrassed apology. Instead, it ended with blood. Something in Vickers snapped at that moment, perhaps the public challenge to his authority, perhaps the witnesses with their phones, perhaps the simple fact that this black woman had not cowered before him the way he expected. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with vicious force. Before Chambers could even cry out in pain, he drove her forward, slamming her face first into the wine shelf with enough force to send another cascade of bottles crashing to the floor. Her reading glasses flew from her face and shattered against the tile. But worse than the glasses was the sound, a sickening crack as her forehead connected with the metal edge of the shelf, splitting the skin open in a gash that immediately began streaming blood down her face. Chambers didn't resist, didn't raise a hand to defend herself, didn't struggle against his grip. Her body went limp, a survival instinct that every black person in America understands, the knowledge that resistance, even in self-defense, can be used to justify even greater violence. Vickers forced her to the ground, driving his knee into the center of her back while her blood spread across the white tile floor, mixing with the spilled wine in a pool that shoppers would later describe as looking like a crime scene. Because it was one. Mira Osei screamed, the sound piercing through the store. Franklin Doyle's voice boomed that this was assault, that he was calling 911 to report a police officer attacking an unarmed woman. Vickers, breathing heavily, his knee still pinning the bleeding judge to the floor, yelled at Grady to control the crowd, to get these people back, to stop them from recording. Grady stood frozen, doing nothing, his failure to intervene being captured by 6 cameras and 4 phones. The handcuffs bit into Judge Chambers' wrists with a cruelty that went beyond restraint. Vickers had cinched them deliberately tight, metal edges cutting into skin already raw from being wrenched behind her back, the pain sharp and immediate on top of the throbbing agony radiating from her split forehead. Blood continued streaming down her face, dripping from her chin onto her beige cardigan, staining the fabric in dark patterns that would later be photographed as evidence. Vickers hauled her to her feet with no regard for her injuries, no concern for the woman swaying unsteadily as her vision blurred from the head wound. Then he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences, that she was under arrest for resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and assaulting a police officer. Every word was a lie. The security cameras had captured a woman who never raised her voice, never lifted a hand, never made a single movement that could be construed as resistance. But Vickers had learned over 18 years that the charges didn't need to be true. They just needed to exist on paper long enough to justify whatever he had done. Chambers, despite the blood in her eyes and the handcuffs cutting her circulation, summoned the same voice she used to silence unruly courtrooms. Clear, authoritative, and absolutely steady, she stated her full name and title for every camera and phone still recording. She was Judge Eleanor Chambers of the United States District Court for the Eastern District, and he was making a catastrophic mistake. For 1 second captured perfectly on Ethan Osei's phone, Vickers froze. Something flickered across his face, a microsecond of doubt, perhaps even fear, as the weight of what she had said began to register. Then the moment passed, and he doubled down with the desperation of a man who had gone too far to turn back. He said he didn't care if she was the Queen of England, that she was going to jail, and shoved her roughly toward the store's exit while her blood left a trail on the polished floor behind them. Raymond Castellanos had managed Harrington's Fine Foods for 19 years, working his way up from stock clerk to running one of the most profitable locations in the regional chain. He knew every employee by name, knew most of his regular customers, and had built a reputation for running a store where people felt welcomed and safe. He was in the back office reviewing inventory reports when a breathless clerk burst through the door saying there was a situation in the wine aisle, that a cop was hurting someone, that there was blood everywhere. Castellanos moved faster than he had in years, rushing through the stockroom and onto the sales floor, where the scene that greeted him stopped him cold. A woman in handcuffs, blood streaming down her face from a wound that clearly needed immediate medical attention. Shattered glass and spilled wine covering the floor of his premium wine section. A crowd of customers with phones raised, their faces showing shock and horror, and two police officers moving toward the exit with the urgency of men fleeing a crime scene rather than processing a legitimate arrest. Castellanos positioned himself directly in front of the automatic doors, blocking the only exit, his considerable frame filling the space. His voice carried the authority of a man defending his territory as he demanded to know what was happening, why a customer was bleeding, what possible justification existed for this. Vickers ordered him to step aside, threatening arrest for obstruction, but Castellanos didn't flinch. He said this was his store, that every inch of it was covered by cameras recording in 4K resolution with crystal clear audio, and that nobody was leaving until he understood why a woman was being dragged out with blood running down her face. Then he pulled out his phone and made 2 calls that would seal Vickers' fate. The first was to corporate headquarters, alerting them that a major incident was occurring that would require immediate legal involvement. The second was to a number he had saved from a community safety initiative 6 months earlier, the direct line to Police Chief Lenora Vance. As he spoke into the phone, describing what he was seeing in precise detail, the color began draining from Sergeant Vickers' face. The power dynamic in that grocery store had shifted completely, and for the first time that evening, the officer who had wielded his badge like a weapon realized he might not be able to lie his way out of what he had done. The flashing lights of Police Chief Lenora Vance's unmarked vehicle cut through the evening darkness of the Harrington's parking lot exactly 18 minutes after Raymond Castellanos ended his call. Chiefs didn't respond to routine incidents, they had captains and lieutenants for that. But there had been something in Castellanos' voice, a controlled urgency that made Vance grab her keys and drive across town herself. What she found when she walked through those automatic doors confirmed every instinct that had propelled her out of her office. A black woman in handcuffs, blood still seeping through a makeshift bandage someone had pressed to her forehead. Sergeant Dale Vickers standing rigid near the exit, his jaw set in the defensive posture of a man preparing his lies. Officer Neil Grady, pale as paper beside him, looking like he might vomit on the shattered glass still covering the floor. And a crowd of at least 15 witnesses, many still holding phones that had recorded everything, their faces reflecting a mixture of outrage and expectation. Vance had been police chief for 7 years, and she recognized a catastrophe when she saw one. Her first question to Vickers was about his body camera footage. He claimed it had malfunctioned, that it hadn't been recording properly, an excuse she had heard dozens of times from officers whose cameras mysteriously failed only during controversial incidents. She asked for a summary of what happened, and Vickers launched into a narrative about a suspicious person, about resistance, about fearing for his safety, a story so riddled with inconsistencies that it contradicted itself twice in the first 30 seconds. Before Vance could respond, Dorothy Ashworth stepped forward from the crowd, her 71 years of moral authority evident in every word. She said that woman had told the officer she was a federal judge, and he had laughed in her face. The silence that followed was absolute. Chief Vance's expression transformed from professional concern to something much harder, much more dangerous for the 2 officers standing before her. She ordered the handcuffs removed immediately, her voice leaving no room for discussion, and called for emergency medical assistance. Vickers opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to continue his fabricated narrative, but Vance silenced him with a single look that promised his career was now measured in hours rather than years. The handcuffs came off, revealing wrists already bruising purple from how tightly Vickers had cinched the metal. A paramedic unit arrived within minutes, and Judge Chambers was guided to a chair while EMTs assessed the gash on her forehead deep enough to require stitches. They said, possibly deep enough to scar permanently. While the paramedics worked, Chief Vance ordered an officer to run the identification that had been taken from Chambers' purse during the illegal search. The seconds that followed would replay in Vickers' nightmares for years to come. The officer's voice came through clearly, audible to everyone nearby, confirming that Eleanor Chambers was exactly who she had claimed to be. Not just a judge, a federal judge for the United States District Court, Eastern District. Not just any federal judge, one who had presided over 17 police misconduct cases in the past 5 years, one who had sentenced a corrupt county sheriff to 15 years in federal prison just 6 months earlier, a case that had made national headlines. One who had direct professional relationships with the Department of Justice, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and every major civil rights organization in the country. The blood drained from Vickers' face so completely he looked like a ghost standing in the fluorescent lighting of the grocery store. Chief Vance walked personally to where Judge Chambers sat, the paramedic still cleaning blood from her face, and apologized with a sincerity that everyone present recognized as genuine horror at what had occurred under her command. Chambers listened to the apology while holding a gauze pad to her still bleeding forehead, then responded with words that carried the weight of her 22 years on the federal bench. She wanted every second of security footage preserved under chain of custody protocols. She wanted every witness statement documented before anyone left the store. She wanted badge numbers, personnel files, and complaint histories for both officers. And she wanted Chief Vance to understand, with absolute clarity, that this incident would not be buried, minimized, or quietly settled. It would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Vance turned to Vickers and Grady, her voice flat and final. Badges and weapons, now. Vickers' hand trembled as he unclipped the shield he had worn for 18 years, the shield he had used to terrorize countless citizens who didn't have the power to fight back, and placed it in his chief's outstretched hand. The videos hit the internet before Judge Chambers had even finished receiving her stitches at Millbrook General Hospital. Ethan and Mira Osei uploaded their recordings to every platform they could think of: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, with captions describing exactly what they had witnessed. Within 6 hours, the footage had been viewed over 2 million times. Within 24 hours, it crossed 10 million. Within 48 hours, the number became impossible to track as the videos were downloaded, re-uploaded, and shared across every corner of the internet. The store's security footage, subpoenaed by federal authorities within hours of the incident, was leaked to a major news network by someone whose conscience outweighed their job security. Cable news networks ran the assault on an endless loop: the shove, the impact, the blood, the handcuffs, all captured in devastating 4K clarity from multiple angles. Legal analysts who had spent careers parsing ambiguous police encounters called this one unprecedented in its clarity. One former federal prosecutor said on national television that this was one of the most clear-cut cases of police brutality and racial profiling ever recorded, that there was simply no alternative interpretation possible. The image of Judge Chambers' bloodied face captured in a still frame as Vickers hauled her to her feet became a symbol almost overnight, shared millions of times with captions about justice, about racism, about the reality of being black in America regardless of achievement or status. Civil rights leaders held press conferences on courthouse steps across the country. The governor issued a statement calling the incident deeply disturbing and demanding a full investigation. The White House press secretary was asked for comment during a daily briefing and responded that the president was monitoring the situation closely. But perhaps most damaging to the Millbrook Police Department was what investigative journalists began unearthing about Sergeant Dale Vickers himself. Those 31 sealed complaints were sealed no longer leaked by sources inside the department who had watched colleagues like Vickers operate with impunity for years. The pattern was devastating. Complaint after complaint from black residents describing the same behavior, the same language, the same escalation from routine encounters to violence. And buried in city financial records, reporters discovered something the public had never been told: the city had quietly paid out over $800,000 in settlements related to Vickers' conduct over the past decade, exposed, and there was nowhere left to hide. The FBI announced its civil rights investigation on a Friday morning. The press conference carried live on every major network. The special agent in charge stood at a podium flanked by American flags and delivered a statement that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. This was not simply an investigation into one officer's conduct, it was a comprehensive review of the Millbrook Police Department's patterns and practices regarding discriminatory policing. The Department of Justice followed within hours, announcing that the Civil Rights Division would be conducting its own parallel investigation, examining how 31 complaints against a single officer had been systematically dismissed over 18 years. By Monday morning, Sergeant Dale Vickers was arrested at his home by FBI agents, led out in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead and cameras captured every step. The charges were federal: assault under color of law, deprivation of civil rights, filing false official reports, and obstruction of justice for his claimed body camera malfunction, which forensic analysis revealed had been manually disabled 30 seconds before he approached Judge Chambers. Officer Neil Grady was arrested the same day, charged as an accessory for his deliberate failure to intervene during an assault he had both the duty and opportunity to stop. The state attorney general convened a grand jury to consider additional state charges, promising that no stone would be left unturned. But it was Judge Eleanor Chambers' televised statement that crystallized the moment for millions of Americans. She sat in her living room, 14 stitches visible on her forehead, the bruises on her wrists, now a deep purple, and spoke directly into the camera with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout her ordeal. She said that if this could happen to her, a federal judge with 22 years on the bench, with direct connections to every lever of power in the justice system, then Americans needed to imagine what happened every day to those without her resources, without her platform, without her ability to fight back. Her voice carried the weight of every victim whose case never went viral, whose assault was never recorded, whose complaint was dismissed and buried. This case, she said, is for them. The federal trial of Dale Vickers began on a gray Monday morning 4 months after the incident at Harrington's Fine Foods, and from the moment the prosecution began presenting evidence, everyone in that courtroom knew how it would end. The security footage was played in its entirety on large monitors positioned so the jury could see every frame, the approach, the demands, the search, the slurs, the violence, the blood. The audio was even more damning than the video, capturing Vickers' voice with crystalline clarity as he said, "You people," as he told Judge Chambers she had picked the wrong neighborhood, as he laughed at her identification of herself as a federal judge. The witnesses took the stand one by one, their accounts unwavering under cross-examination, because they were simply describing what the cameras had already proven. Dorothy Ashworth, her voice steady with righteous conviction, described watching a woman her own age being brutalized for the crime of buying wine. Franklin Doyle, his military bearing lending weight to every word, testified that in 30 years of service he had never witnessed such a clear abuse of authority. Medical experts displayed images of Judge Chambers' injuries, a fractured orbital bone that required surgical repair, a severe concussion with lasting effects, and permanent scarring on her forehead that no amount of cosmetic intervention could fully erase. Use of force specialists, including a former police chief and an FBI training instructor, testified that Vickers' actions were not merely excessive but criminal, that nothing in his training or experience could justify a single moment of what he had done to a compliant, unarmed woman. The defense tried desperately to construct a narrative of threat, claiming Vickers had genuinely feared for his safety, but the footage demolished every argument before it could take hold. The jury saw a 58-year-old woman in a cardigan, pushing a shopping cart, holding a bottle of wine, who never raised her voice or her hands, even as she was beaten and bloodied. They deliberated for just over 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge, a colleague of Chambers who had recused himself from the civil proceedings but presided over the criminal trial, sentenced Vickers to 12 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under sentencing guidelines. Officer Neil Grady, who had stood silent while a woman was assaulted, who had followed unlawful orders without question, who had failed in his most basic duty to protect, received 3 years for his complicity. As Vickers was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he passed within feet of Judge Chambers, who sat in the gallery with the same composure she had maintained throughout. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The civil lawsuit was settled 6 weeks after the criminal verdicts, but the word settled failed to capture what Judge Eleanor Chambers had actually achieved. The monetary amount, $14.5 million, was the largest police misconduct settlement in the state's history, a number that made national headlines and sent shockwaves through municipal insurance markets nationwide. But Chambers had made clear from the beginning that money was never her primary objective. She had enough money. What she wanted was change, and she used every ounce of her legal expertise and moral authority to ensure she got it. The consent decree attached to the settlement was unprecedented in its scope and enforceability. 6 officers with complaint histories similar to Vickers' pattern were terminated immediately, their sealed files unsealed, and their victims notified. The department was required to implement mandatory body cameras with no officer-controlled off switches. The cameras would activate automatically during any civilian interaction and could only be deactivated by supervisors reviewing footage in real time. An independent civilian oversight board was established with full subpoena power, the authority to compel testimony, and the ability to recommend termination and criminal referral. All misconduct complaints would be disclosed publicly within 30 days, ending forever the department's practice of burying allegations in sealed files. And in a provision that Chambers had insisted upon personally, the department's training academy was renamed the Eleanor Chambers Center for Constitutional Policing, a permanent reminder of what happened when officers forgot who they served. Police Chief Lenora Vance, who had arrived at Harrington's that night and seen immediately the catastrophe her department had created, resigned 3 days after the settlement was announced, accepting responsibility for the institutional failures that had allowed Vickers to operate unchecked for 18 years. 4 city council members faced recall elections, 2 resigned before the votes could be held. And in the weeks following the settlement's announcement, 3 other victims of Dale Vickers came forward with stories that had never been told. A young black man stopped and beaten during a traffic stop in 2019. A black teenager detained and humiliated outside his own home in 2021. A black nurse subjected to an illegal search outside her workplace in 2022. Each received their own settlement. Each received an apology. The system that had protected Dale Vickers for nearly 2 decades was being dismantled piece by piece, and Judge Eleanor Chambers oversaw every moment of its demolition with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything in her life. 1 year to the day after a routine trip to buy wine became a nationally televised symbol of racial injustice, Judge Eleanor Chambers walked back into her courtroom. The gallery was packed with colleagues, supporters, and journalists who had followed her story from that bloody grocery store floor to this moment of return. There was something different about her now, a thin scar running along her forehead, faded but unmistakably visible. Her clerks had suggested makeup, had offered the name of an excellent cosmetic dermatologist. Chambers refused. The scar stayed visible, a permanent testament to what had happened. A reminder that justice was not an abstraction but something worth bleeding for. In the months that followed, she established the Chambers Justice Initiative, providing free legal representation to victims of police misconduct who lacked the resources to fight alone. She spoke at law schools, police academies, and congressional hearings. When interviewers asked how she felt about Dale Vickers now serving year 2 of his 12-year sentence, her answer never varied. She said she didn't think about him. What she thought about was the next person he would have hurt if those cameras hadn't been rolling. She thought about the 31 people who filed complaints before her, who had no viral videos, no national outrage, no justice. This was never about her. It was about what happens in the dark when no one is watching. The documentary about the case ended with footage that had become iconic. Vickers being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, the same restraints he had used on Judge Chambers, his head bowed as he walked toward a prison transport van. The screen faded to black, and white text appeared. 31 complaints, 18 years. One moment of truth. A final reminder that the system had been given 31 chances to stop him, and it took a federal judge bleeding on a grocery store floor before anyone finally did. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers, everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night. 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it, and I'll catch you in the next story.